Welcome to Sewing Anastasia, and today we are making a Chanel-inspired 255 purse. That's right, this purse is inspired by the classic Chanel bag. It has a quilted outside. There's a pocket inside with a zipper. It has all the hardware on the outside and on the back of it as well. The fun thing about sewing up your own purse is that you can make it out of any fabric you want. You can even make it match your outfits as long as you interface it and make it stiff enough. And so here I've chosen 3 different prints to sew it up out of. And then the leopard one over here, I quilted the fabric, and that's one of the extra lessons in this month's club. We are going to go over how to quilt fabric so that way you can get that Chanel look-alike vibe. So you can have your very own custom-made little purse. And this sewing pattern is exclusive in my online sewing club for the next 30 days. And then after that, you can get it through the links down below. So if you want to sew along with me right now, check out the link down below for the sewing club. Or if you're already a member, go download your pattern. And one of the perks of joining the sewing club is that the patterns are less expensive there, and you get to join the Discord so that way you can talk with all of your other fellow sewing friends there about your projects. And if you need help with anything, I'm always there to answer your questions on all the projects. It's a fun, all-inclusive community, and you might even make a sewing friend. This video today is going to be in a little bit of a different format because it is for the sewing club, so it's going to be going lesson by lesson. So what are we waiting for? Let's get started on this quilted quail. Now it's time to gather all of our supplies and prepare a few of our pieces before we start sewing. And we're going to need some different supplies than you're used to for clothing because we're making a handbag. There's some different hardware and interfacings. Before we do anything, you need to print out your pattern, and there are 2 options. There's a large format version that you can send to a printer or use on a projector, and then there's going to be the home printer version, which is A4 and letter compatible. Now let's go over the pattern and the fabric pieces you should have cut out to make the quail purse. You'll notice you have 4 pattern pieces that say reinforcement on them. They are going to be for our interfacing. Then we have our pocket pattern, which is optional, but I am going to be adding the pocket to the purse today. You're also going to have the little D-ring straps. You're going to have 2 of those. And then you're going to have the body of the bag pattern, your self fabric, your outside fabric, and then a lining or an inner fabric. And I am using the quilted fabric today for my outer fabric, but you don't have to use quilted fabric. Any sturdy fabric will do. Speaking of types of fabric for the bag, you're probably wondering, what kind of fabric can I use for this bag? Well, I would choose something sturdy. It could be a denim, it could be a twill, it could be a quilted fabric, it could be an upholstery fabric. You're going to want to use something that has a bit of body to it, so that way it can hold its structure. If you use something real thin like a satin, you're going to really see these big interfacing pieces through the fabric. So you want to make sure you're using a nice sturdy woven fabric. Now let's go over the hardware you're going to need for the bag. You're going to need 1 clasp for the front of the bag. You're going to need 2 D-rings, and you're also going to need a strap. I went with a chain strap because I think it looks nice and professional. It really reminds me of those Chanel bags, but you could also make a fabric strap if you like. And you're also going to need a zipper if you are choosing to put the pocket on the inside. And you do have some options for the clasp on the front of the bag if you don't want to buy a store-bought one. You could use a button and a buttonhole, a snap, Velcro. You could tie 2 little ribbons so that way it ties shut with like a little bow. And we all know I love bows. So you're not just limited to the metal clasp, but I think it's a really nice professional look. And there are going to be links in the course here so that way you can order the exact same supplies if you'd like. And if you want to order the same hardware that I'm using, there will be links down below. Now let's talk about the special interfacing we're going to use. Now the interfacing we're using isn't for garments. This is a really thick, you can see how thick it is, sturdy, fusible interfacing made for bags. So I'm going to have a link down below so you can also order the same one if you like, but you're going to want to use an interfacing that has a really stiff body and hand to it. So that way our bag can have structure. Now that you have all of your fabric and hardware gathered, we do have one prepping step before we start sewing. So what we need to do before we start sewing is add the interfacing to the back side of our self fabric. So our interfacing's cut, Now we need it to be placed in these exact spots, otherwise things will not sew together properly. This pattern is very precise for it to work. So what I'm going to suggest you do is actually cut out these rectangles, so that way what we can do is lay this pattern on top of our fabric and then place our interfacing inside of the rectangle as a little template. So that way they end up in the exact place they need to be. So I'm going to take my rotary cutter so it can be very precise, and I'm going to cut out these rectangles on our body pattern for the bag. Now that I have all 4 rectangles cut out, it's time to do some ironing. So I have my body bagged fabric. Mine is quilted, but we're going to flip it over and we're going to put the interfacing on the back of it. Now, if you don't have a quilted fabric, you're not going to have this lining fabric here. It's just going to be on the back of your fabric. So we're going to take the pattern, the template here, and we're going to line it up very precisely around the edges. And then we're going to take our interfacing pieces that we cut. We're going to make sure we have the glue side down, face down, and we're going to fit them right there in those rectangles. I'm going to get some little weights to weight these down, and then we'll give it a good iron. Now I have my pattern weighted down, and I have my first piece of interfacing weighted down, and I'm going to work through these pieces of interfacing, and I am going to weight them down. You can always push a pin through your fabric as well to the ironing board below if you don't have some smaller weights around. And now that I have these weighted down, I am going to remove my paper, because if I hit steam with this paper, it's just gonna get all nasty on me. So carefully remove your paper. And now that I have the paper removed, I'm going to place a pressing cloth on this side. Give it a good iron. Lots of steam. And you should see it starting to stick to your fabric. And once you see that, you can move down. Maybe I'll remove some of these irons here. Make sure things are still in place. I am giving a little pressure while I go over this to really make sure it's sticking down. If you have a clapper, you could also use a clapper. And now we have the interfacing fused to the back side of our purse body. Now our fabric is prepped and we are ready to start sewing. In this lesson, we're going to go over how to quilt fabric, so that way you can have a cute little quilted purse, a quilted quail, if you will. This step is optional, but it's going to look so cute. I was inspired to create a quilted bag after the Chanel 255. It's a classic bag that I've seen my entire life, and it's so fun. It was made in February of 1955. That's why it's called the 255. So let's go over what you need to quilt this fabric. First, you're going to want to cut out your bag pattern here, so that way you can figure out how much fabric you need. So you want to cut out fabric bigger than the pattern piece, because it's going to move around and create height when we're quilting. So after you got your pattern piece cut out and you figured out what size you need, you want to cut out your self fabric, the outer fabric. I'm using this leopard twill today. You're also going to need a piece of batting. Now this is really up to you how thick you want it to be, how puffy you want it to be. And then I'm going to be using a backing so the quilting doesn't get caught in the machine. I'm just going to be using a lining fabric. You could use a plain piece of cotton as well. You'll also need some additional supplies to make this go super smooth. So here I've got a walking foot, which is going to work great with all those thick, bulky layers. I have a single needle plate, which is going to prevent the fabric from pulling into the machine because there's a very little opening where the needle goes. We're also going to need some chalk and a ruler. Now that you have all of your supplies gathered, it's time to start quilting. And the first thing we need to do is draw all of our quilting lines on our self outer fabric. So I have my fabric right side face up. I've got my quilting ruler and I have some chalk. So I'm going to be drawing 45-degree angle lines through the fabric. So I'm going to line up the 45-degree line on the ruler with the selvage of my fabric. So here's the selvage, and there's my 45-degree angle line following that. And now I'm going to draw a line through my fabric. If your ruler doesn't reach the end of your fabric, just move your ruler out and continue. Now we need to draw one more line on there, and that's going to be a line going through the other line that we've already drawn. It's going to be an intersecting line, also at 45 degrees. Just like before, I have my ruler set up with 45 degrees at the selvage, and now I can draw a line through my fabric. And now that I have these two lines drawn on the fabric, we are ready to set everything up and start quilting. I drew my baselines on the fabric, and that is all I need because I'm going to be using a guide bar. And so this is going to help me measure out my 1 inch while I'm quilting. Now, if you don't have one of these, you're going to want to draw all of those lines on the fabric. You are going to cover it in lines spaced out 1 inch away from each other. So I highly suggest getting a walking foot with a guide bar. But again, if you don't have the guide bar, you're going to want to draw these 1 inch lines through your entire piece of fabric, going both ways, so that way you know exactly where to sew when you're quilting. Now it's time to put all of our layers together so we can start quilting. First, put down your backing fabric, and then you're going to put your batting on top of it. After that, you're going to place your self fabric, your outer fabric, on top of the batting. Make sure it's right side face up. Make sure you don't have any wrinkles or creases in it. Now I'm going to go ahead and just put a few pins in it as well to hold all the layers together. So I'm going to start towards the middle and just put a handful of pins in here. You can buy special quilting pins that are curved on the bottom. So if you have a lot of really thick fabric, it doesn't bend your pins, and it's a little easier. But I'm not using super crazy thick fabric, so these regular pins are working just fine. You can also buy special quilting pins that have longer metal pieces on them. That can also be helpful. Now that I have everything pinned together, it's time to start quilting. So now we need to change out the foot on our machine before we start sewing. You really want to be using a quilting foot. You could also have a quilting foot built into your machine. It's basically called a dual feed foot. So basically what's going on are these extra little grippy bits on the bottom of the foot are grabbing the top piece of fabric, and you've got the feed dog on the bottom, so it's clamping the fabric and pulling it through. Normally, we don't have little grippy bits on the top of the foot here, the bottom of the foot, so then it's going to slide away, especially with all the layers. So this foot helps keep all your layers together when you're working through the machine with your fabric. The other thing I'm switching out is the plate on the machine. So you're going to notice the opening on the plate that's currently on it is a big oval shape. So this is going to take your zigzag stitches. You can really move your needle position a lot. But the fabric sometimes likes to get pulled down in there, right, when you're sewing. So we're going to fix that by putting on the single needle plate here, the straight stitch plate. So the opening here is much smaller, so the fabric doesn't get pulled down into the machine. It's going to give us a nice even stitch as well. It's going to give us a little bit of a better tension. On my machine, I'm not going to put on an extra walking foot, but I have this little lever that I'm going to pull down and swing under my foot, and it acts as the walking foot. Your machine might have this as well. Check it out in your manual. So this is what I'm doing instead of putting on the walking foot. I'm also going to attach my guide bar right now, so it just goes in the little hole in the back of your walking foot or your machine, and I'm going to move it over to 1 inch and then tighten it because that is how big I want those little squares to be. Now that I've tightened it, it's not going to go anywhere. For the first row of stitches, I want you to stitch down the line that you drew on your fabric. Now that we have one row of stitching right where we drew that line, we're going to go ahead and put in the other one that's going to cross through it. So that way we're basically stabilizing our fabric in like a big X. There we go. So you can see that X right in the middle there. So now what we want to do is continue stitching lines, and we're going to use this guide, or you're going to use the lines that you drew on. So if you're using the guide, you're going to line up the guide with your last row of stitches, and that's going to make your needle an inch away from that last row of stitches. So when you're stitching, you're watching this guide, not the needle or the foot over here. But obviously make sure you're not going to be running into any pins. Just try and keep everything nice and flat. You can always add more pins if you feel like you're getting unnecessary bulkage in the quilting. Now I'm going to add another row here and just continue the same process. So I'm going to quilt all the lines going one direction, and then I'll flip my fabric around and go the other direction. So now I have all of my lines of stitching going one direction. So now I'm going to turn my fabric and I'm going to put in all the lines going the other direction, and then we'll get nice little quilted squares. Let's finish quilting this fabric. We are all done quilting. Let's go check it out. Look at how cool our quilted leopard is. I love it. It's so fun. And it wasn't even that hard to do either. So this is what it looks like on the front. And this is what it looks like on the back. So you can see we've got the lining fabric in there, and we got the puffy little squares because our batting is inside. So that is one way you can quilt your fabric for the quilted quail version. Now we're going to go over attaching the zipper pocket to the inside of the bag. And we need to do this first before we start sewing the sides of the bag together, because we don't want to see that stitching on the outside of the bag. And this step is optional. So if you don't want zipper pockets on the inside of your bag, then you can skip ahead. And you can even add 2 zipper pockets on the inside of the bag if you like. First thing we're going to do is take the pocket lining piece, and we're going to iron under one side a 1/2 inch, because what we're going to do is place it right next to the zipper teeth and then edge stitch it down. So I've ironed the top edge down a 1/2 inch. I'm placing it right next to my zipper teeth. I've put on my all-purpose zipper foot on the right-hand side, and I've moved my needle position all the way over to the right. So I'm going to be stitching this piece of fabric down just right next to the teeth. And now we are done with that step. And you can see how nice the fabric looks right next to the zipper teeth, and it still zips up really great. So the zipper is sewn on, and now you need to do some ironing. You're going to iron in the sides a 1/2 inch, you're going to iron the bottom up a 1/2 inch, and then the little zipper tails on both ends, you're going to iron those in a 1/2 inch as well. And now it's time to place the pocket. To place the pocket, I want you to use your template as a guide. So essentially our pocket is going right here in the second little opening. So it's going to go in there like that. So I'm just going to mark the ends with some chalk, so that way when I remove the template, I know exactly where it's at. So I'm just going to mark these corners. And now I can remove the pattern. So now I can see exactly where I want this. So to sew the top of the zipper, you could leave it flat and just sew it down. I'm going to flip it back, and I'm going to line up this edge here a 1/2 inch down. So it is best to use a ruler, and I'm going to measure a 1/2 inch down on that little right angle there. So that way I know exactly where to place my zipper tape. So I'm going to place my zipper tape there. We're going to sew in the middle of the zipper tape, and we're going to sew those little ends in when we're doing this. And then the pocket is going to flip back like that, and then we can top stitch and edge stitch down the edge of the pocket. So with my zipper all lined up, I have my zipper foot on the left-hand side, and my needle position is center. It's going to be thick at the beginning, so just start up a little further than normal. Make sure you're moving, then go ahead back stitch. Back stitch to the edge, and now come all the way down. When your zipper pull gets in the way, just make sure needle down, foot up, and zip up your zipper. Come all the way down to the edge, add a few back stitches. We're going to take the pocket and we're going to flip it down, and you can see how nice it's looking. So we're going to pin all of the edges down. And when we do this, I want you to unzip the zipper halfway, so that way it doesn't get in the way of you sewing. Now that we have all 3 sides pinned, we're going to add a little edge stitch all the way around, and you can do a top stitch if you like all the way around as well, just to keep the pocket nice and reinforced. I am sewing the top edge of that zipper down flat. Watch the metal piece on the zipper. You want to make sure you're not sewing into it. And now I'm going to go around the edge and I'm going to add a little top stitch. I'm going to stop before I get to that big metal piece on the zipper. Back stitch. And let's take a look at it. So you can see we have our pocket sewn down with the edge stitch and a top stitch, and our zipper opens up beautifully so we can fit our phone in there or whatever you'd like. Now that the pocket's on, it's time to start sewing the rest of the purse. Now we are ready to get this bag together. And the first thing we need to do though, before we start sewing, is put on one of our pieces of hardware. And this is going to be the back of our clasp that we're adding right now. To put on the clasp, what we want to do is place our pattern on here and make sure you put that rectangle back in if you did cut it out, and make sure that the U shape is facing the smaller part of the bag. And now we're going to use an X-Acto blade and we're going to go through all the layers, and we're just going to get a little opening in the fabric so that way we can get the back of the mount through the fabric and all the layers. So you don't want to cut a giant hole in everything, just enough to push it through. Now I'm going to remove all the paper. So I've added some chalk right where my holes are so you can see them. They're right here. Notice on the back of this mount, we have 2 prongs. We want those 2 prongs to go through those holes. And again, if you're using this one, make sure the U shape is facing the smaller part of the bag. And we're going to get those prongs to pop out on the back side. Now that the prongs are popping out on the back, we're going to put that little piece on there and we're going to bend down those little prongs. I'm going to use a little pair of pliers here. You know, you can use a quarter or a penny or something as well and just push them down. We just want them to grab onto this metal rectangle. So nice and secure, flip it over, make sure it's not going anywhere. And now we're ready for our next step. Now it's time to work on the D-ring strap, and there's 2 of them. You're going to flip your fabric so the wrong side is facing up, and then we're going to iron in the edges so that way they meet. You essentially want this little piece of fabric to fit inside of your D-ring, which is about 1 inch big. After you iron it, we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew down the sides. You can either add an edge stitch or a top stitch or both. It's really up to you. And you're going to do the same thing for both of these. So I'm adding a top stitch to the edge of the side. You don't have to back stitch on these. Then they should look something like that. Now that we're done with these little D-string straps, let's talk about where you need to place them and how to sew them on the bag. We're going to use our template again, and you're going to notice this little spot that says strap mount, and that is going to be for these little D-ring straps. So I want you to cut a slit in your paper and then go ahead and put a mark right there. So with the chalk, so that way you can see it on the outside when we remove it. So now I have 2 marks here. And what we want to do is put the D-ring on the strap, fold it in half, and then we're going to line up the raw edges right with that chalk mark. We're going to sew it down through all the layers, and then we're going to take it and we're going to flip it up, and then we're going to sew it down again right next to the D-ring. So your first stitch is 1/4 inch away from the edge, And then the next one, when you flip it up, I want you to get as close as you can to the metal D-ring. And I'm gonna suggest that you put on your all-purpose zipper foot to do this. And you're gonna do the same thing to both sides. So I'm sewing this on 1/4 inch away from the edge. Make sure you're back stitching at the beginning and the end. We're gonna go all the way across the back. We want this to be nice and strong. We don't want our straps falling off. I'm gonna do this to both of them before I put my zipper foot on. I'm gonna put the zipper foot on and we're gonna get nice and close to that D-ring. Just really make sure you don't hit that metal with your needle. Could mess up your machine, definitely will break your needle. So now we're gonna take the D-ring, we flip it up, and we're going to sew next to the D-ring. Take your hand wheel and pull the needle down. Make sure you're not too close. This is a great way to just double check this. Kind of keep it pulled out to the right. Watch your hands in there. Make sure you're back stitching. I'm gonna go all the way back, nice and strong. I'm gonna do the same thing to the other side. Once your D-rings are attached, they should look like that. Now we're gonna sew the lining to the self, but before we do that, we need to turn under the top edge a 1/2 inch. So now what we wanna do is turn in this long edge a 1/2 inch. So this long side here, a 1/2 inch on the lining piece and on the self piece. And it's gonna be a little tricky if you have that quilted fabric, so be careful. You're probably wondering what's on the back of my fabric. I did fuse some interfacing to it because I just wanted some more body to my lining fabric because it was so lightweight. But you don't have to do that, it's just like an extra step. So I have that top edge there ironed down a 1/2 inch on the quilted one, the outside one, and on the lining. So now we're gonna place these right sides together. And I want you to pin these layers together. Make sure you're matching up all of your corners. The top edge should line up and match. Once you have this all pinned together, we're going to sew all the way around with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, leaving those folded edges open. And it's a great idea to chalk your corners with the 1/2 inch seam allowance so that way you know exactly where to turn. It's going to be really important that we're actually turning at the 1/2 inch because this is going to keep our bag having really nice corners and sides. And if they're not at a 1/2 inch, they're not going to line up. So I'm gonna do that to all my outward and inward corners on the bag. I've got my walking foot equivalent set up. So I've got my regular foot with the walking foot pulled down. I'm using a regular stitch length of 2.5, and I am using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which is gonna be so important that you use the proper seam allowance on this. Don't forget when you turn corners, needle down, foot up, and pivot. Come all the way to that inward corner, needle down, foot up, and pivot. We got another corner, needle down, foot up, and pivot. When you get to the end, make sure you sew all the way up with those edges folded in, back stitch. Let's take a look at it. Now that we have it sewn up, it should look something like this. Before we flip it right side out, we wanna make sure we're clipping our corners. We wanna cut off the outward corners to get rid of that bulkiness, especially if you did quilting. So you can really cut around the edge here. Just make sure you're not cutting into your stitch. Then your inward corners, I want you to clip into them. Make sure you don't cut through your stitch, so they should open up. So that's what you're gonna do to all your corners on the bag. Once you have everything clipped, it'll look like that. You've got 4 outward corners to clip off and 2 inward ones to clip into. Now we're gonna turn it right side out, and it can feel a little stiff because we have all that interfacing in there. You could have a thick fabric or a quilted fabric. So just keep pushing it, and then it's gonna flip right side out, and you're gonna wanna make sure you push out all those corners. So you might need to get a little tool called a pusher, or put your fingers in there and push out all those corners. And if you feel like you can't get your corners pushed out enough, make sure you go back and clip more. There's a good chance you just need to clip a little better. And then pop out your sides. And then it should look something like this. Look at that cool pocket on the inside with the zipper. We've got our D-rings and our clasp on the outside. So now you're gonna notice it's a little puffy, and that's not just from the quilting. We've got these edges here. So we wanna take these edges and iron them. We just wanna press everything nice and flat. Make sure all your corners are pushed out. Look how nice these inside corners are. Those look great. They should be looking like that for you as well. Now that it's all ironed flat, it's time to do some top stitching. So we're gonna start with top stitching this big opening here down. And remember, your top stitch is a 1/4 inch away from the edge. And since our seam allowance up here is a 1/2 inch, it's going to keep that shut. And while we're top stitching this down, we're going to continue all the way around the entire bag. I have my fabric lined up with a 1/4 inch spot, and we're just gonna stitch all the way around this bag. And if you don't wanna use back stitches, you can use the fix button on your sewing machine if you have one. Take out any of your pins before you get to them. I did end up using clips on some of the edges. I felt like it was a little easier in spots. I'm right back where I started. I'm gonna add a few back stitches, and we're done with that step. I have the top stitch going all the way around the bag, and it looks great holding the layers together. Now we're gonna add a little edge stitch, so 1/8 of an inch away from the edge on this really long edge here. It's gonna help keep those two layers together more, and we're also gonna be adding edge stitches to a lot of the bag throughout the next steps. So it's just gonna make it match the rest of the bag really nice. So I have my fabric lined up with 1/8 of an inch. I'm gonna make sure I'm back stitching in the beginning, or again, you could use your fix button. And now we have that nice. Now that that edge stitch is complete, we're gonna take these little flaps on the side. They're almost like little wings or ears. We're gonna fold them to the inside. We're gonna give them a really good press so that they wanna stay there. And then we're going to add a little edge stitch on this folded edge here. So I have this little flap folded in, and now I'm going to edge stitch it down. And I am going to be adding a few back stitches. And I wanna mention, I'm starting at the 1/4 inch point. I'm not starting at the very back edge. But on this end, we're gonna sew all the way up to the edge. And now I'm gonna do the same thing to the other side. So you can see that this stitch right here is helping hold these sides of the bag into the side. Now we're gonna take these flaps on the side, and we're gonna iron them in half, right sides together. And then what we're going to do is add a little edge stitch, but we're gonna stop 1 inch from the bottom. So I'm going to mark up 1 inch from the bottom and chalk it on both sides so I know exactly where to stop. And this edge stitch is to keep the pleat at the side of the bag folded inwards. There's my 1 inch spot, so I'm gonna stop there. I'm gonna add some back stitches. Now I'm gonna do the same thing to the other side. So you can see I have this nice pin tuck here, and it stops 1 inch away from the bottom of the bag. And you can see that it's creating that inward crease, kind of like an accordion at the side of the bag. So here's where the bag really comes together. We are gonna sew these sides up, and then we're gonna have a purse. To sew the sides up, we need to take the panel and we're gonna flatten it out. Now this is why we didn't sew that very bottom inch, because we need to flatten it out. And we're gonna add a little edge stitch, and then we're gonna stop when we're that 1/4 inch away, and we're gonna pivot, and then we're gonna take the side and we're gonna turn it, and then we're gonna sew all the way up to the top edge of the bag here. And we're going to do that on both sides. So I'm sewing that short bottom edge together first, making sure I'm back stitching. And it's just 1/8 of an inch. We're gonna come all the way down to the edge. We're gonna make sure we're stopping about 1/8 of an inch away from that edge there for that bottom flap. Maybe one more stitch. There we go. Now we're gonna turn it and sew up the other side. So now I've turned the bag and we're sewing up the side. Really have to use a lot of pressure on your hands to hold everything down and hold it together and in place. Make sure it stays lined up. You're gonna come all the way to that top edge. You're gonna add some back stitches. And then we are done sewing. Look at how awesome our bag looks. Look at those sides, the back. All we have left is the clasp for the front and then our chain for the back. To put the other part of the clasp on, we're going to take the end and we're going to put it at the edge of the bag. But what we want to do to make sure it's lined up is take the little lock here and put it inside, clasp it together, and then mark those 2 holes there with chalk. Make sure everything's nice and lined up, and then we can remove it. And then right where those 2 holes are, we need to poke some holes. So you could use a belt hole puncher, you could use an awl. It really depends on how thick your fabric is. Let's try an awl first and see if we can get this through. Oh, looks like we can. So I'm just gonna push that through. And now I'm gonna do the same thing to the other little spot that I marked. Now I'm gonna grab the other end of my clasp. Okay. So now what we're gonna do is take the clasp here and put it right over those 2 holes. And then we're gonna take this piece and we're gonna push it through those little holes. It's gonna pop out on the back side, and then we're gonna clamp them shut. And then we're gonna take those little prongs there and we're gonna push them towards the inside of that clasp. You might even wanna use a pair of pliers, really push those down. And then we've got a clasp that works. And then we're going to be able to push our clasp together, and now our bag is nice and secure and professional looking. Now all we have to do is attach our strap, and that's real easy. So there's a few different ways you can attach your strap. You can just attach each hook to each end here, and then you'll end up with a really long strap. Or what we can do is undo one of the clasps, take it, put it through the D-ring, and then we're gonna clip it over here. And this is going to allow us to make a shorter strap. Or we can pull it, and then you're gonna end up with the chain in the back, like the Chanel bags, and then we'll have the strap on the top. We are all finished and now have this awesome new quilted purse. So in making this bag, you learned how to quilt some fabric, how to attach a clasp onto the bag, and how to get a nice pocket on the inside with a zipper. So that way you're not going to lose all your belongings. We also have a really nice lining in the bag. Don't forget we use that sturdy foam interfacing, so that way our bag has a lot of really nice structure to it. You learned how to create these cool pleated sides with the pin tucks, and how to attach the D-rings and the strap to the bag. Now that you've learned how to construct a purse, maybe next time you'll look at the purses in your wardrobe a little differently. I always think it's interesting to use all of our garment skill knowledge to construct other things like accessories or home goods, and how all of those skills carry over in sewing to other products. Yeah. Iris liked their purse so much that she came up to check it out. It is officially cat approved. Thank you so much for being a part of the sewing club. I hope you enjoyed this month's pattern. I cannot wait to see what kind of fabrics and what kind of quilting techniques you add to this bag to make it all your own style. Thank you so much for watching Sew Anastasia today. And don't forget, if you want this purse pattern, you can get it exclusively for the first month in my sewing club. Or if you're already a member, head on over there and download the pattern right now. There'll be links down below for everything. If you enjoyed the video today, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you know when all the new videos come out. I put out all kinds of videos all week long. And if you want to learn even more about sewing, make sure you check out my online and in-person sewing classes. There's links down below for those as well. And if you want to know what's going on in the studio right now, make sure you check out my Instagram stories. I'm always posting. Thank you so much for watching today. Bye!